She lived like a queen, died like a heretic, and bled like a lamb upon the scaffold of vengeance. The snow outside Fotheringhay Castle lies untouched, pure as Judgment Day's shroud, but inside, the stone walls sweat with the chill of death and the scent of old betrayals. In this remote English stronghold, a queen paces her final days not in regal procession but in chains of velvet and silk, shackled not by iron, but by envy, doctrine, and the bloodlust of monarchs who rule with smiles sharpened into knives. This is the death of Mary, Queen of Scots, a daughter of France, a widow of Scotland, and a prisoner of England, whose execution would not only stain the scaffold with royal blood, but mark the twilight of a sacred order, the triumph of steel over sacrosanct bloodlines, and the shattering of the divine illusion of monarchy itself. On the first morning of February the 7th, in the bleak year of 1587, as frost clawed at the leaded panes and the breath of horses steamed in silence beyond the castle walls, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, opened her eyes not to the warmth of sun nor the rustle of velvet drapes drawn by devoted maids, but to a stillness so profound it pressed upon her chest like the weight of a tombstone. A silence broken only by the distant, dirge-like rhythm of boots echoing along the stone corridors, each footfall a countdown to the ritual slaughter of a sovereign. A letter lay on the table, the Queen of England's warrant, sealed not with wax but with quiet hatred, the ink dry and colorless, yet heavy with the weight of betrayal. Elizabeth, her cousin, her mirror, had delivered her to death not by sword or battle, but through silence, absence, and cold bureaucracy. There would be no summons to court, no final words in the tower, only this quiet decree, carried on shaking parchment by men who could not meet her eyes. Mary reached for her rosary, the beads smooth and worn from decades of whispered Ave Marias and muttered acts of contrition, but her fingers trembled, not with fear, but with rage. The impotent fury of one who had once worn crowns in 3 kingdoms and now stood as a relic, condemned not for treason, but for existing in the wrong faith, under the wrong sky, in the shadow of the wrong queen. They told her, with faces pale as wax and voices stripped of empathy, that she would not be permitted a priest. No confession, no absolution, no sacrament. The blood of Christ would not cross her lips. The host would not be placed upon her tongue. Her sins, real, imagined, inherited, would remain nailed to her soul as surely as the nails once pierced the flesh of her crucified Redeemer. In death, she would not be cleansed, only discarded, like carrion not fit for heaven's gate. For Mary knew now, in the damp chill of her final dawn, that she would not die as a queen. She would die as a heretic, an offering, an omen. The moment the heavy wooden doors groaned open, a breathless hush fell over the great hall, as if the very walls, long soaked in chill and mildew, inhaled sharply in anticipation of sacred desecration. The flickering torchlight danced across stone columns like phantoms grasping for her hem, casting shadows that twisted with each echoing step, not forward, not backward, but downward. For this was no walk of dignity, but a slow, orchestrated descent into death. Mary Stuart stepped forth, not with trembling limbs nor faltering gaze, but with the eerie poise of one already resigned to being erased. Her gown, the deepest crimson of dying embers, swept behind her in a long, silent wake, as though the blood she had not yet spilled had already begun to mourn. Sewn by candlelight in the still, suffocating silence of her final nights, the fabric bore the scent of sweat and candle wax, its seams pulled taut by the fraying tension of a woman who had nothing left but symbols, the color of martyrdom, the softness of mercy denied. Her face, under the pale haze of morning rot and prison air, was drained of all vanity, all courtly polish, gaunt, hollow-cheeked, the delicate parchment of her skin marked by the invisible ink of too many betrayals, too many graves, too many years swallowed in silence. Her eyes, once bright enough to command kings and seduce empires, now bore the still, unflickering glow of a candle placed too close to an open window, not quite extinguished, but surrendering to the wind. The scaffold loomed at the far end of the hall, a crude wooden platform slick with frost and varnished with the blood of nameless traitors who had died without hymn or history. Atop it stood the block, misshapen, scarred, and soaked dark with old blackened stains that no hand dared scrub clean. The axe rested nearby, its edge dulled by repetition, not mercy. A thick red cloth lay draped over a low stool beside the block, a mockery of coronation robes, prepared to absorb whatever dignity her neck could no longer carry. Each step Mary took echoed like a tolling bell through the cavernous chamber, the sound muffled slightly by the thick rushes beneath her feet, rushes that had once cushioned the dance of royal weddings, now reeking of old urine and the iron stink of panic. Her legs, weakened by confinement and years of kneeling to no one, threatened rebellion beneath her, but she pressed forward with the stubborn grace of a woman who had already accepted that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to history now, to theater, to spectacle. Her thoughts, if they could be called such, flickered between scripture and memory. The cry of her infant son pulled from her arms, the chill of the French court where she learned to smile with poison behind her teeth, the warm summer air of Scotland before it turned red with civil war. And over all these, louder than any voice or psalm, came the unrelenting pounding whisper, "Do not fall, not now, not in front of them." The guards flanking her exchanged glances, their fingers twitching near their hilts as though proximity to a dying queen might summon divine retribution or unearth old curses buried beneath their uniforms. One coughed and spat into the straw, perhaps to expel the lump forming in his throat. Another looked away entirely, his face paling as the woman he had grown up hearing stories about. Mary, the jewel of the French court, the widow of Scotland, the cousin of the Virgin Queen, was now little more than flesh in motion, a holy animal led to slaughter beneath the carved ceiling beams that bore witness like a forest of saints turned to stone. The priest, a Protestant appointed by Elizabeth's court, stood at the base of the scaffold, holding a worn Bible and murmuring verses she refused to hear. She did not respond, for his words, though scriptural, were hollow to her, the voice of the enemy, not of God. Her lips moved instead in Latin, quietly, urgently, whispering invocations to saints who no longer had kingdoms, who had watched cathedrals burn and altars desecrated in the name of reform. She reached the foot of the scaffold, and for a moment, just a breath, a heartbeat, the flutter of a candle's flame, her steps faltered, not from fear, not from uncertainty, but from the sudden, intimate realization that these stairs, each slick with dew, each groaning beneath her, were the last ascent she would ever make. The climb to her own execution was the closest thing to a throne left to her. When she reached the top, she turned to face them all, and they, 100 souls or more, gazed upward in a silence so total it seemed the room had been sealed in glass. She looked not at the bishop, nor the headsman, nor the assembled spies who would write this moment down in secret, coded reports. Instead, she gazed past them all, into the cold high rafters, as though watching for angels or vultures, or both. Her voice, when it came, was steady, regal, and low, more echo than speech. "I die a Catholic and a queen." And though not one of them dared speak, several among the witnesses shivered, not from the chill, but from the dreadful certainty that they were not watching a woman die, but an age being buried alive. Some would swear, years later, that they heard music faintly playing as she stood there. Others would claim that the smell of roses filled the hall just before the axe was raised. But those who looked closely, those who truly saw, would never forget the way her gown bled into the straw, the way her breath formed no mist in the air, the way her shadow stretched behind her like a crimson trail into the grave. The air was thick with a silence so brittle it seemed one whispered breath could shatter the entire hall. A silence born not of reverence, but of unbearable anticipation, as if every man and woman present instinctively sensed that what was about to unfold would not be a clean passing into history, but a brutal, twitching defilement of it. The headsman, a hulking figure summoned days before from London's southern outskirts, stood at the edge of the scaffold with the posture of a condemned soul forced to carry out the punishment upon another in his own stead. His hands, mottled and calloused, gripped the axe as though it were alive and writhing, its blade dulled from years of use, not yet sharpened for ceremony, as though the steel itself recoiled at the thought of royal blood. Sweat slid in greasy rivers down his temples, not from labor, but from a primal dread that no amount of coin or command could wash away. Mary knelt, calm as a saint, and placed her chin upon the block, the wood worn smooth by the breath of the dead, slick with frost and unseen filth, still stinking faintly of the last man's panic. Her crimson skirts pooled around her like spilled wine at an altar, soaking into the straw laid thick to muffle the thud of her body, once severed. She reached beneath her veil and tied a blindfold herself, slowly, deliberately, her fingers trembling slightly only near the end. And for a brief moment, the world held its breath, as though the angels themselves looked away. Then the axe was raised, and time fractured. The first blow did not bring death. It brought shame. It landed with a sickening wet crunch, the sound of splintered bone and the tearing of sacred flesh, as steel met spine and stopped short, trapped in her body like a nail half driven into holy wood. Her back arched involuntarily, her lips parting in a small, breathless exhale. Not a scream, not even a groan, but the soft, wounded gasp of something greater than a woman breaking beneath the weight of man-made failure. The executioner staggered. A low murmur rippled through the crowd like a serpent slithering across a chapel floor. Muffled gasps, stifled cries, the sound of courtiers turning away to vomit into their sleeves. One of the guards dropped his halberd with a metallic clatter, the sound too loud, too sudden, like a blasphemy shouted in a cathedral. The bishop, whose hands still clutched the Protestant book of prayer, flinched as blood arced from her neck in a slow, steaming spray and dotted the white linen of his vestments. He stared down at the stains, his mouth a slack, trembling line, unsure whether to wipe them away or kneel in horror. Was this divine punishment for permitting the death of a Catholic queen, or divine affirmation that her grace must be erased with pain? Mary did not move again. Whether consciousness had left her body or she simply refused to grant her tormentors the dignity of reaction, none could say. But her body remained bowed, her spine crooked like a broken reed beneath a storm, and the blood now pooled across the straw in thick pulsing globs that steamed in the cold February air like sacrificial incense. The headsman lifted the axe again, but not before muttering something beneath his breath. A garbled prayer, a curse, or perhaps just the fractured syllables of a soul trying not to fracture alongside his victim. His second strike was faster, more desperate, and crueler in its lack of precision. It cleaved into the half-severed neck, biting deep, but once again refusing to release her from suffering. Her body jolted as the blade struck, and the sound this time was something inhuman, a hollow, meaty snap, followed by a tear that echoed like parchment ripped too slowly. Flesh hung in loose ribbons, her vertebrae now visible beneath split muscle, a grotesque cross-section of royalty turned raw. A third blow followed, not in ceremony, but in haste. This one severed what little remained, and with a dull, final thud, Mary's head fell from her shoulders and rolled onto the straw, the blindfold slipping away to reveal eyelids that fluttered open for a breathless moment, as if some fragment of soul still lingered behind them, blinking blindly into eternity. The executioner reached down to lift the head by the hair, and with a flourish meant to display triumph, but carried out in trembling disbelief, he raised it aloft before the stunned assembly. But as he did, the false curls, carefully pinned into place to preserve the illusion of youth, tore away in his hand, and the head dropped with a wet slap back into the blood-drenched straw. What remained was not the image of a queen, but of a withered woman, her real hair thin, gray, cropped close to the skull, matted with sweat, blood, and the final humiliations of long captivity. The illusion had shattered. The queen was dead. The mask of sovereignty had fallen from her flesh like rotted lace. Some fell to their knees. Others turned away, crossing themselves with trembling hands, whispering prayers not for her, but for themselves. For what they had just witnessed was not justice, not even execution, but desecration. In the rising stench of opened veins and fouled linen, in the silence broken only by the scratching feet of rats emboldened by gore, it was clear to all that something sacred had been murdered. Not just a woman, not even just a queen, but the last breath of divine right itself. And far above, in the rafters where dust danced like motes of ash, it felt as if the very heavens had gone still, watching, recording, judging. The air had shifted. It was no longer the solemn hush of ritual, nor the tremulous breath of witnesses holding their tongues in reverence, but a suffocating stillness, heavy and grotesque, as if some ancient curse had been exhaled into the room, thickening the torch-lit air with a silence too dense to break, too reverent to disturb, and too cruel to justify. The executioner, his gloved hands still glistening with warm royal blood, reached down with the perfunctory reverence of a man trained in theater as much as punishment. His fingers found the familiar resistance of styled curls, auburn, rich, vibrant even beneath the pall of death. A queen's hair, the hair that had once graced the courts of France, the thrones of Scotland, and now the block of a Protestant scaffold. He lifted her severed head aloft with the trained motion of spectacle, prepared to proclaim, to offer, to display. But then, it came loose. The curls tore away like false petals from a rotting flower, and the object in his hand ceased to be a symbol of royalty and became instead a damp, bloodied relic of shame. A wig, thick with pins and threads, soaked in the stale smell of aged scalp, cheap perfume, and the sour undertones of slow decay. What remained in his grip was not her. What remained on the straw-drenched platform, still rolling slightly from the last convulsion of gravity, was a head that no longer belonged to myth or to memory. Beneath the mask of auburn silk was something altogether more human and more horrifying. Her real hair, once hidden by powder and vanity, was gray, coarse, cropped unevenly close to the skull like that of a sickly pauper or madwoman. Sweat clung to it in a waxy sheen, mixed with the yellow crust of fevered nights and the black specks of lice that had made their home in royal flesh. Her scalp bore sores, raw, weeping, irritated by years of wigs, tight pins, and whispered degradation. A priest gasped, dropping his book. A lady-in-waiting covered her mouth with a trembling gloved hand, the edges of her fingers turning white with pressure as bile rose in her throat. The bishop who had prayed over her, reluctantly and with eyes averted, took an unconscious step backward, his hands still stained with the blood that had splattered from the second blow, as though proximity to this grotesque unveiling might curse his tongue or corrupt his soul. And among the watchers, among the nobles and gentry who had journeyed through frost and mud to witness the extinction of a queen, there was a collective inward collapse, a mourning not for the woman who had just died, but for the death of illusion. For what lay before them was not the noble Saint Elizabeth had hoped to destroy, nor the villainous Jezebel her ministers had described, but simply a broken, sickly body, old, disgraced, and unrecognizable. The spell had shattered. The head, now bloodied and faceless beneath its peeling dignity, stared outward with one half-lidded eye that remained slightly open, not in accusation, but in blind, eternal exhaustion. It was an eye that had seen too many prisons, too many betrayals, too many nights curled alone in a damp bedchamber, whispering prayers into stone walls that never echoed back. From beneath the folds of her discarded skirts, soaked through with her own steaming blood, came the sudden, piercing yelp of a creature too small to understand grief, yet too loyal to escape its scent. Her dog, a small, trembling spaniel, pale as cream and spattered with blood not its own, crawled out from beneath the crimson fabric like a child emerging from a womb of carnage. Its paws slipped in the warm fluid that now pooled across the scaffold like a sacramental offering. It let out a single, broken whimper, and then pawed frantically at what remained of her, at the limp, lifeless sleeve of her gown, at the dark puddle that had soaked into her bodice, at the emptiness where her head should have been. Then, as if confused by the smell of death on the woman it loved, the dog began to lick the blood with soft, instinctive strokes, not out of hunger, but from a deep, primal devotion, as if it could somehow restore her soul with its tongue, or drink back the years that had been stolen, one lap at a time. The sight drew no comfort. It was no tender image, no scene of loyalty to soothe the conscience of witnesses. It was a grotesque pietà in fur and agony, the last living creature to mourn her not for her title, nor her legacy, but for the simple, unspoken intimacy of presence. A servant dropped to her knees and wept openly. A guard looked away, muttering a prayer in broken Latin he barely remembered. And somewhere in the back of the crowd, a young page vomited violently into the rushes, unable to erase the sight of flesh unraveling beneath powdered deception. Overhead, a beam creaked, a long, mournful sound like the groan of a cross swaying in windless air, and the torches along the walls flickered violently, as if disturbed by some invisible gust, or else by the passing of something that did not want to go quietly. And in that moment, that awful, still moment, where shame clung heavier than smoke, where dignity lay soaked in piss and blood, the myth of Mary died more truly than when the axe fell. She had been queen, prisoner, mother, heretic, saint. But now, she was only meat. And the silence that followed was not born of reverence or remorse. It was the stunned quiet of witnesses realizing, perhaps for the first time, that death does not honor crowns. It strips, it spills, it reveals, it devours. Mary's body, still warm with the echo of breath, was gathered in haste, not with reverence, but with caution, as though the limbs might twitch again, as though her lips might part and call down thunder upon the men who dared touch her without prayer, without sacrament, without love. Her head, separated, smeared with ash and blood and stray hair, was wrapped in rough linen and placed beside her like an afterthought, not as part of a whole, but as evidence, a relic of state murder disguised as justice. There was no mass, no censer swung in smoky circles, no choir sang her into the afterlife, no sun to press a kiss to her brow, no priest to whisper the ancient words of release. She was embalmed not by gentle hands or oils of myrrh and frankincense, but by coarse agents who stuffed her open body with sawdust and herbs to stave off the inevitable rot, a process done quickly, clumsily, and in secret, while her entrails, still steaming and slick with half-clotted blood, were buried in a shallow pit beneath the gallows, like offal discarded from a butcher's slab. Her gowns, soaked through with blood and feces, were stripped and burned in a hearth that had once warmed visiting nobility. The flames fed not only by fabric, but by fear. Fear that a lock of hair, a thread of silk, a dried stain might be taken as relic, as icon, as weapon for rebellion. Even dead, Mary was dangerous. Even dismembered, she was sacred to someone. The room where her body was laid overnight, a former chapel, now stripped of altar and crucifix, stank of copper and vinegar, of old damp and something sweet and curdled, like spoiled milk left beneath a child's crib. Rats scratched in the corners, the torches guttered, coughing smoke into the stone ribs of the ceiling, and the women assigned to clean the chamber crossed themselves again and again, some whispering fragments of Latin prayers long forbidden, others spitting 3 times over their shoulders to ward off what they felt crawling at the edges of the room. A presence, not of spirit, but of unresolved pain. They say that the next morning, one of the serving girls was found catatonic in a corner, curled tight as a spider's prey, her eyes wide and unblinking, lips torn from biting them in silence. She never spoke again. The only sound she made was a soft whimper, always the same, always before rain. Mary's body, once dry, was placed in a plain coffin and buried in haste, without a marker, without hymns, beneath a slab more suited to a thief than a queen. The location was chosen for convenience, not sanctity. Far from any altar, far from the realm of sainthood, in a place where the wind never ceased and the earth remained cold even in spring, as though the soil itself rejected the weight of what had been done. And yet, the castle did not forget. In the weeks that followed, chambermaids began to hear crying in the walls. Soft at first, like the distant sobs of a child, then louder, more insistent, until one night, the steward himself swore he heard a voice, sharp and sorrowful, whispering in French, "Je ne suis pas fini. I am not finished." Servants refused to sleep in the upper rooms. A nun who came to exorcise the place fainted at the threshold of the scaffold, her last words before collapsing. "She is still here. She is watching." And in time, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of political convenience, her remains were disinterred and moved to Westminster Abbey, her bones carried under heavy guard through streets that had once cheered her downfall. There, She was laid beside the very cousin who had condemned her, Elizabeth I, in a tomb too ornate, too late, too silent. But stone does not silence memory. The abbey priests claim that on certain winter nights, when the wind scrapes the stained glass and the moonlight creeps across the crypt like the hand of a penitent ghost, they hear soft footsteps pacing above the tomb, and those who stand too long in the shadow of her statue, head bowed, eyes closed, report a sudden cold upon the neck, a prickling of the spine, a sensation not of being watched, but of being judged. She was buried, she was moved, she was honored, but peace never came. For Mary was not merely killed, she was silenced, humiliated, fragmented, and burned. And in doing so, something was torn from the fabric of the world, something holy, something furious, something that still claws at stone and soul to be remembered not as a heretic, not as a failure, not even as a queen, but as a wound that would not close. And Fotheringhay remembers, even if the crown does not. The scaffold was dismantled, the blood scrubbed from the planks with lime and salt water, though never fully gone. It clung in the grain like memory trapped in bone. Her body buried, her head hidden, her name struck from court. And yet, even as her limbs cooled in their dishonored coffin and her soul, if such a thing still lingered, drifted above Fotheringhay like smoke too thick to rise, Mary's death refused to die. They had beheaded the woman, yes, but they had not severed the line. From the ashes of that execution, the very flame they sought to extinguish flared brighter than ever, and in the womb of history, the seed they hoped to bury took root instead. A root twisted in blood and prophecy, destined to crack the very foundations of monarchy. Her son, James, a boy torn from her arms, shaped by Protestant tutors and cold Calvinist austerity, raised under the suspicious gaze of those who had condemned his mother, bore within him the weight of two crowns, the ghosts of two kingdoms, and a bloodline now sanctified by suffering. He would live, he would reign, and in the cruelest irony that fate ever carved into royal skin, he would sit upon the very throne his mother was slaughtered to protect. England's crown laid not at the feet of Elizabeth I's chosen heir, but at the feet of Mary's. The knife had failed. The execution that was meant to be the end of a line had instead become its coronation. But her posthumous ascent was not clean. It was not triumphant. It was a slow, festering legacy carried not in parades and proclamations, but in secret masses whispered behind shuttered windows, in portraits smuggled beneath bodices and sewn into altar cloths, in images of a queen with downcast eyes and a rosary clutched in pale fingers. Saint, martyr, mother, her neck encircled by a faint red thread where the blade had kissed her spine. To the recusants, those English Catholics who refused to bow to the new order, Mary became not a fallen sovereign, but a sacred wound. Her face adorned hidden chapels. Her name was spoken in code among imprisoned priests, written in the margins of banned books. Her relics, forged or real, were kissed like holy bones, scraps of veil, drops of blood on linen, hair said to be hers sealed in lockets worn close to the chest. She became not only a woman who had died, but a ghost who bled meaning into every quiet rebellion that followed. In the shadows of convents and catacombs, in exile and in terror, believers whispered that her death was not execution, but crucifixion, that the axe had not merely opened her neck, but opened a passage through which divine judgment might one day flow, that England would pay, that the crown would rot from within, and rot it did. For Elizabeth, though triumphant in appearance, died alone, childless, haunted not by her cousin's voice, but by the silence she left behind. A silence that echoed too loudly in the corridors of power, that spoke through the cracked mirrors of Whitehall and the rusting keys of her chamber door. No air of her body, no flame of her own blood to carry forward the golden age she had so violently protected. Only James, Mary's son, Mary's vengeance wrapped in a velvet doublet, crowned with the blood of both Scotland and England, would claim what her axe had tried to deny. When he entered London in the spring of 1603, the bells rang not for Elizabeth's memory, but for his coronation. Mary's blood, once spat upon, burned, buried, now ruled both thrones, and so the curse was fulfilled. The axe had not silenced Mary. It had given her voice eternal, not in proclamations or triumphs, but in dread, in myth, in the irreversible intertwining of dynasty and desecration. Her death had become a hinge in time, a moment from which neither kingdom could turn back. The scaffold became an altar, the blood became ink, the silence became legend. Even now, historians may argue over her guilt, her innocence, her ambition, her vanity. But none can deny this. Hers was the bloodline that broke the crown. Not with sword, not with fire, but with a head that would not stay buried, and a name that would not be erased. And still, in the hush between reigns, in the echo of cathedrals long emptied of saints, one might swear they hear her whisper, not of revenge, but of prophecy fulfilled. I died for nothing, yet my death was everything. As the light of Tudor England dimmed into the dusky twilight of dynastic uncertainty, there echoed beneath the vaulted ceilings of Westminster, across the rotting beams of Fotheringhay, and through the marrow of every silent courtier who had stood and watched, the unmistakable thunder of steel meeting sanctified flesh, a final rupture that split not only bone, but belief itself. Mary's beheading was not just the death of a woman. It was the orchestration of a ritual meant to unmake a myth, to cauterize a bloodline, to sever the neck of an idea that had reigned unchallenged for centuries, that monarchs ruled not by steel or strategy, but by divine right, by God's own breath made flesh. And yet, it was precisely through that butchered flesh, still twitching, still steaming, that the illusion began to rot. She had once danced through the jeweled galleries of Versailles, draped in silks that whispered like secrets in the candlelight, her laughter a soft rebellion against fate. She had sat atop the throne of Scotland, young and radiant, her skin still untouched by exile, her womb heavy with hope and heirs. She had been a bride, a widow, a mother, a sovereign, and each role had been taken from her, piece by piece, like a lamb slowly skinned in prayer. And still, she had endured, until that final morning in February of 1587, when she laid her neck to the English block and surrendered the last thing they had not yet stolen, her body's boundary. Her face, pressed into unplaned wood soaked in centuries of betrayal, had become a mask not of queenship, but of sacrifice. Her scalp peeled back, her dignity pooled at her feet, her crown transformed into a twitching stump beneath a trembling blade. They killed her for her threat, for her faith, for her blood, but above all, they killed her for her symbolism, for what she might still become if allowed to live. And in doing so, they did not purge the fear, they embalmed it. Mary did not become a saint. No holy light burst from her wounds, no miracles bloomed from her grave, but she became something far more haunting. An omen, a mirror, a warning carved in blood. Her bones may rest in Westminster beside the very cousin who signed her death. But her story will never sleep. It lingers in shadowed halls and moss-eaten cathedrals, in damp prison cells and on the lips of exiled daughters, in the yellowing vellum of secret letters and the velvet folds of half-burnt portraits smuggled across borders in fear. And some say, though they speak it only on stormy nights when the wind lashes against the stone and the fire crackles low, that when the scaffold creaks in an empty castle, or when a stray dog whimpers at a chapel threshold, her voice is there, just beneath the breath of history, not angry, not mournful, just quiet, just watching. I was a queen once, and I died like a ghost.